Good morning and welcome to Shh, It's a Secret, not on the 6 o'clock news conference here in Tempe, Arizona. I'm Dr. Chet Snow and I'll be your host this weekend. We're now continuing our Sunday morning program. The second speaker on Sunday morning is a man that I met some time ago, and then recently he got in touch with me because he felt he had some information that was important to share here at this weekend event. And after talking with him briefly, I agreed with him, and I thought it would be very fascinating, especially in view of the fact that he really has done some exploring and some fieldwork research that is quite unique. Greg Nielsen is from Utah, our neighbor state to the north. He has lived in Arizona for a number of years. He now lives in Mesa, Arizona, right here in the valley. But what really brings him to us is the years that he has spent exploring the highways and the byways of the desert Southwest, not in search of Baghdad Cafe, but in search of ancient Baghdad cafes, ancient times, places where the Anasazi and the pre-Anasazi lived and ruled. And he has come up with extraordinary discoveries about forgotten and now essentially extinct races, some of whom we would call giants, and some of whom are very big stature. And even more interesting is the cover-up that is taking place, and I think that's the best word for it, of this facet of our ancient history that is going on even today. To the very extent that he even told me sometimes he doesn't go to certain places where he knows there will be artifacts, because he says, I'm being watched. If I go there, they'll come in, they'll sweep them up, and no one will ever hear of them again. So without further ado, I'm going to have Greg Nielsen come to the stage, and he's going to talk about ancient giants of the American Southwest. Greg.
Thank you. Do I want that one, or am I wired in? I want to just run the wire. Here, give you that one back. All right, I want to thank Callista and Chet for the opportunity here. I don't normally do this very often. I more like to stay in the background because our sources kind of dry up for information when you get real public in your exposure. However, in this particular case, it was like, I'm supposed to be here. So I kind of went back and says, all right, after listening to Barbara on Friday and listening to it again last night, I said maybe there was a reason why this had to happen. As a background, let me tell you a couple of things that actually led me to where I am. I actually started out with just a big curiosity. I don't really have an agenda that is to make a living out of this. We kind of do a weekend warrior type thing where we just go out on the weekends, find there's a lot of stuff out there to be found, and then started putting together. It was strictly a curiosity-driven thing. What you do when you start going out, and instead of just reading it in a book or watching it on Discovery Channel, go out and do your own investigation. You start finding out there's a lot more out there. I'm going to explain in just real quick detail today. We don't have a lot of time. I'm just going to go through and highlight a bunch of stuff. Okay, first question. If you sit down as a kid, you've heard the whole giant stories out of your kids' stories. You've heard the stories out of the Bible. You've heard all kinds of stuff about giants. Most of the time you attribute them to mythology, to things that you've never seen or heard. And they are just fantasies. They're the tooth fairy. They're the Santa Clauses of the world. However, you've got to ask yourself why they are almost universal around the planet. And it's like there is a question that starts to come to your mind. You say, okay, what if I told you that there actually are giants? They're finding their tombs, they're finding their bones, they're finding their burial sites, they're finding their artifacts, and then they don't quite always get to the public. We found that as we started to go into this thing, it was actually very, very blatantly obvious that there was a reason why this stuff never gets to the public, but we'll go into that in a bit. All right, giants. They start out, let's go back and we have to do a little bit of groundwork laying real quick. When you go look for old stuff, when you're out there in the field, when you're actually looking for things, what you end up with is you have a real problem with, I mean, you go back there and this is what something looks like after it's been exposed to Mother Nature for about 2,000 or 3,000 years. We're dealing in giants who are back in the 40, 50, 100,000 year range. that doesn't have much of an indication that there's ever been any human use of those particular rocks. That's actually a wall on a archaeological site. How I got into this thing is that we started doing a bunch of explorations up on the Grand Canyon area looking for some old caves. Those of you that are internet junkies will know there's an old cave artifact thing that was found back in 1909. It's a whole nother story, really an interesting one. But as a sidebar, we started finding out that the giants were using that area. And so we started going back and looking for the giants as a sidebar to the other adventure we were on. So before you start looking for giants, you basically have to go back and start looking at your history books and say, what's wrong? So you go back to some of the indigenous tribes. In this case, it was the Hopi. They have a four-world system. Their system says that we're in the fourth world. 3 times before, the entire continent, the entire planet has pretty well been wiped clean. You've had civilizations on the equivalent of what we're living in today that are virtually erased. And they have a whole set of legends to go through. Their first world was destroyed by fire. Their second world was destroyed by it was actually a pole shift, and they actually knew what a pole shift was. I've been talking with Grandfather Martin, and there's actually a whole lot of information. The indigenous tribes who we think are backward, stupid, dumb, don't know anything. Actually, they know a lot more than we do because they've been allowed to understand their world. We have a manipulated understanding of ours. So what happens is that their third world was destroyed by the flood. Now we start having a historical record. There's a universal planetary record of the flood. What you end up doing is saying, this is where our history books start. Pretty much we have very little information prior to the flood. And I understand there's been a number of floods, so we're talking the planetary event here. Okay, when you go back and you're starting through doing what I do, which is basically look for old civilizations in the American Southwest, you have to go back and get yourself a timeline. We use a timeline that sort of looks like the Hopi system, where we go through and we say, in the first case, we're talking about a historical period from here back to about 12,000 BC, or about 15,000 years ago. We call that was pretty much the diluvial event. From the Atlantean period backwards, we go into the Lemurian period. That one drops back from about 50,000 BC to we think right around the 400,000 mark. And these are real hard numbers to come by because there's no history books, there's no archaeology, there's nothing to base this on except what you go out there and figure out for yourself. Then we go back to the very ancient past, and there's some things that pop up that don't fall in any of the other categories, and you're just saying, okay, we haven't got a place to put those, so we lump them all together. We'll see a couple of those at the end of this presentation. Most of what we're working on as far as the giants comes in the area of about 50,000 years ago. We'll go through sort of a timeline. We believe they came to the planet and started interfacing probably right in the 400,000 year range. But the Atlantean period was dominated on this planet from what's been explained to us. There was a very dominant civilization that was primarily the Atlantean civilization were the big boys, or we call them big guys. They were giants by our definition. So we have to go back and define what a giant actually is, okay? For our purposes, even though I have to thank Barbara for the segues that she put in, because it was certainly nice to follow her. There is from what we have in the historical record, or what things we have in myth and legend and lore, we have about a 35-foot top range for the giants. There were bigger ones, but we don't have any legend lore referring to them. So we kind of say in the ones that we are actually sitting here and finding remains of, they're in the 8 to 20 foot range. And what you end up doing is when you go out there and find an 8 or 20 foot tall guy, by the way, that little guy that was there was the biggest man on the planet until there's now a Russian guy that's replaced him. He was 7 foot plus. When you line up skeletons, I want you to notice this is the little 6 foot guy. This is a normal average guy. We're finding in this area up to the 32 footers, not a 36. We're on the trail of some 32 footers. They're hard to find because they're originally what we've decided is actually what's happening is, as these beings came to the planet and stayed, they started to go down the scale size-wise. These are giants equivalents. We have a number of, in this 12, 13, 15-foot range. That's what most of the ones that are coming out here in the Southwest are. However, we've been told by some of the indigenous people of tombs that are actually of the 32-foot guys. I want you to notice, that little 6-foot guy doesn't even come mid-calf to a big guy. You got to understand how big these guys are. This is about a 16-foot, 15-foot ceiling right here. That little thing for up there where the lights are hanging from, that goes up to about 20. Visualize somebody standing here hunched over talking to you today. This is where you get in trouble when you start dealing with these guys. It's so hard to wrap your mind around, you really have a hard time talking about it, except for the people that are out there doing it with you. This is the country where we actually go looking. There's a lot of stuff here in the Southwest. It's been inundated a couple of times, but there are a lot of artifacts that start showing up. They come in from a number of sources, usually people out prospecting stuff. They don't recognize it as a Spanish artifact, don't recognize it as anything, so they say, hey, what's this? And it starts to show up. And if you're in that network, things that don't have any explanation, they can't put it to the Indians, can't put it to the settlers, and can't put it to anybody prior to that, these artifacts start showing up. But we have to take a real quick side trip here. We have to go back and set up the giant thing. Are we talking about something that's a figment of our imagination, or is there some evidence to support it? Everybody knows the story of David and Goliath in the Bible. He was a 10-foot guy. What most people don't know is he was actually out of a tribe of giants. And they were hired mercenaries. They would be hired out by the local armies to be their front man. That was why Goliath was important, was he was actually part of what most people in the Bible consider the Nephilim as a race of giants. They were still living on the planet in our historical times. That's my point. Greeks, same thing. They have very old traditions. You have the Titans, you have the Cyclops, and I can't say that other word, so I'm not going to try it. But they actually have whole myths and legends and lores about what the giants actually were. They're scattered all over the planet. Every continent has giant stories. So you're sitting there saying, apparently they had the ability to migrate anywhere they wanted, which meant they had technology. I was over in Thailand a couple of years ago, and it was interesting because these were actual life-size representations of the guards that used to guard the royal family in Thailand. And I was asking what the deal was, and they said they hired these guys from Mongolia, which is kind of the foothills of the Himalayas. And they would come down, and they were hired to guard the royal family. And I'm saying, oh, that's interesting because they're about 14 foot tall. You go back in your other legends, you go back and start looking at what some of these are old artifacts that are coming out in the 1000 BC's range. Archaeologists, when they hit a thing like this, they actually say, well, that guy's represented big just because he was important. I'm going to contend that he's represented big because he was big. This is a Sumerian tablet, same thing. Sumerians were basically, anybody follows Stitch and stuff, they were actually interfacing with off-planet beings that were giants. This is a Sumerian tablet. These are your human guys. This guy's supposedly important, so therefore he's big. I'm going to contend, so does Stitch, that he wasn't just important, he was actually that size, or relatively that size, which would mean he's somewhere in that 20-foot range. Israel, there's the whole Israeli archaeology system agrees that this was built by the Nephilim, which was the giants. It's funny how that looks sort of like a crop circle if you actually think about it. That's located in Israel. Okay, Stonehenge. Interesting problem. One of the tools we use to go look for things is regressive hypnosis. So we bump into a bunch of people, several, who were giants and have past life memories of actually building that guy. Later on, the Druids came in, used it as a ceremonial site because it was already activated. So there's a little thing to chew on is, what if that was actually built by the races of giants? Then we'll throw some just geologic evidence at you. This is a hatchet head. This is just footprints. We have a number of footprint pictures here. This is a petrified skull. We have a time constraint, so we won't go into detail on all of these. That's a human skull alongside of the petrified one. This guy's about twice, so he's 12, 15 footer. These are 18-inch, 20-inch tracks. That's another one, 20-inch, 25-inch track. That means you're talking about a 10, 12-foot guy. These are some prints. They're scattered all over the planet, guys. This is the point. You just go look and you're going to find out they're all over the planet. When you are dealing with actual artifacts that are bones or some kind of skeletal remains, what you're getting is, this is actually a thumb bone. This is this joint right there in the human thumb. That being that has a thumb that's, if using all other proportions being equal, that being has the thumb that is probably 2.5 times that particular structure, means that you're talking about a 12 or 15-foot guy. That's why we keep saying this there's a big, our historical data kind of stops in that 15-foot range. All right, so even though they're referenced in historical times and there's a lot of stuff going on that would support what you're doing, you still have this issue of, you read it in a book, you saw it on the internet, somebody jacked around with the Photoshop pictures, whatever it is. And so you have to go back to where that wasn't really available, which is some of your old reports out of newspapers and other places, especially in this country. We were digging out everything from mounds in Ohio and New York area to looting all the artifact sites here in the Southwest. And we did it for almost 100 years before there was any control whatsoever. So you go back and you start reading about all these guys that are 8, 10, 12 foot tall that are coming out of the mound burial sites. They're looting them out of sites here in the American West. And you say, okay, none of those guys had any reason to be exploitive as far as the internet or selling books or whatever they're trying to do. Oops, gotta go back on that. The other thing is that we have a number of interfaces with giants in our modern historical records. So the giants didn't die out just as an extinction event. They actually kind of tapered out because of a biological fact that they could not support their population. In other words, you start inbreeding and eventually that will cease your species. This is Captain Cook when he went around Patagonia. They have records of actually interfacing with giants there in about the 12-foot range. They actually took one on board the ship, and he got about 1 week out from shore, escaped from, they had him chained to the mast, he escaped, jumped overboard, and never saw him again. But this is all in Cook's diaries. You go back in 1931, you're going, this is just a newspaper account here in the Southwest. This is where you start looking. Here's a reference, and this is before the real big censorship available in today's government took place. So there were still people out finding things without the big thumb of government coming down on top of you. Again, the thing that's kind of interesting about this one is that they're only 8 or 9 footers, but remember, that's a pretty good sized guy. We haven't got anything like that today. And they were placing them at 80,000 years. And this is done by an archaeological assessment of the timeline. Of course, there's those that believe we're only 6,000 years for the whole planet, but so there's a contradiction there. The other part of this equation is that you actually have some bones that have been recovered and have been kept in the public or publicly available. This is a thigh bone. It's a good reference picture for how big things really are. It's very hard to visualize. It's really difficult to wrap your mind around. That's only about a 14-footer. This is an actual picture of a 12-footer taken out in Ireland. It was taken back in the early turn of the century, so there's a few pictures of it available. But the thing that you have to remember is that these have all disappeared. Even though you have a picture of this guy and he was actually excavated, brought in for public display at that time, it was eventually just disappeared out of the, disappeared off the face of the earth. One last guy, this is King Og. He basically is in the Bible as listed as the size of his bed's actually listed as what he was one of the last of the surviving giant kings. and he's referenced there, but he was a big boy, probably 12 foot. Then you come to this other problem. Because there is a certain amount of fascination with giants, and we all heard about them as kids, there's a lot of stuff that goes out there on the fake side use. So they're good for little roadside attractions. This one is a roadside attraction. This one popped up, went through the internet like a fire about 2 or 3 years ago. And in all honesty, it's a fake. But in relative size, it's actually a pretty good indication of what you're talking about, because this would be something equivalent to about a 25 or 30 foot structure. However, it was just it's like the Photoshop manipulation thing. You have to be careful what you see. This is one of those other ones where you start to get question marks. Why is there question marks? Because this one is really quite difficult to duplicate in Photoshop. But is it or is it not? These are coming out of the Egyptian and the Sinai Peninsula area. Then you have some more. These are out of the American West, but these were taken early enough that you don't have any way to really fake the image the way we do today. When you were faking images that were taken in old tin types and stuff, they were much more difficult to manipulate than what we are with Photoshop. This one's really hard. This is a really tough one. It's a really good Photoshop job, or maybe it's the real McCoy. This is out of Saqqara in Egypt. And you're going, okay, if this is the real McCoy, we have a problem. The trouble that we find is that when we go back after this information intuitively, you find out that there were giants in Saqqara. They were off-planet beings interfacing that were big guys. And so you now have an issue of, is this the real McCoy or is it a Photoshop disinformation? And they do dress like that and look like that. I was just there this summer. All right, so here's a question. This is what I'm going to throw out to you guys. So you're sitting there saying, I'm getting up on Saturday morning, I have a free day, I'm going to go find a giant. How do you do it? I mean, in all honesty, we actually had that actually crossed our minds at one point. We made a decision, say, you know what, let's go find a giant. And this was a few years back, and you say, okay, so where are you going to start? What are you going to do? So we says, let's stay close to home. So we live here in the Southwest, so let's stay close to home. So then we went back and started researching. We went and contacted a lot of the indigenous tribes. We've dealt with their elders. We've dealt with their medicine men and women. We've gone back and taken all the traditional routes and says, oh yeah, these guys have all kinds of stories about giants. And we're saying, oh, that's interesting, because we thought they were all dead. And we thought they were all dead a long time ago. But what we actually found out is that they were actually a declining race. They were inbreeding. Their DNA eventually reached a point where it couldn't be sustained, and they were dying off in little pockets. That's what we feel will happen. We have a situation where the 35-footers that we actually have got a handle on, very difficult to get a handle on and get the trust of Indian tribes. That's why we don't talk very much, is that they don't like the fact that you're out here peddling their information. So that we very rarely see this information rarely sees the light of day. There's a set of 35-foot giants. This is a very difficult thing to visualize, but I'm going to tell you what they've told us. There's a set of 35-foot giants in the Four Corners area. Apparently there's 8 of them. They're buried in a cave. They're in granite sarcophagus in sandstone caves. The lid is actually made out of crystal. You can actually see the foggy image of the giant that's encased in the tomb. The problem is that they don't seem to be decayed. So they're actually in stasis. Or the Indians believe that they are in stasis. In other words, that body is still functional to the point where it can be reactivated. Now that's kind of an interesting legend coming out of a tribe of, indigenous people that don't know anything. And so you go back and say, we know that one exists just by the fact that we found other things that are in similar situations. Only we've never had 35-footers. Most of what we're finding is in the 12, 15-foot top range. So we focused on 12, 15-foot top guys. This is the area we actually go looking. We find that there is an area of giants where there have been giant remains found within that light blue area. And for the most part, that's as far as we've found they go. There's like this was their range of occupation. There have been dozens, if not hundreds, of giants found within that blue spot. Problem is you don't have any record of it. Matter of fact, you don't even know, for the most part, the public doesn't even know that that's happened. This is the kind of country we go looking in. It's not fun, not easy, totally difficult. Those are people standing right there. This is down in the Grand Canyon on one of our trips. And it's a situation where Grand Canyon has excavated a lot of geology. You have a long timeline going down into the canyon. And there was a giant occupation site right along the northern Arizona border. That giant occupation site was using basically the Grand Canyon as a hunting ground, and they were interfacing with other indigenous people there. That brings us back to this problem. We have local legends and lore that tell you that the giants have been here. Not only have they been here, they've interfaced with them. So if you ever wondered why everybody tells you in the archaeology business that the giants are, that the reason they built their cliff dwellings and they built their houses on the edge of cliffs in defensive positions was because they were warring tribes. To a certain degree, that's true, but there's another explanation that if you go talk to their elders, they'll tell you that there's another explanation for that. Originally, they were sharing the northern Arizona, southern Utah area with an entire it wasn't a civilization, it was a surviving culture of giants. And in the good times, they would come in and raid their crops and steal their food, and they'd starve for the winter. In the bad times, the Hopi told us they were dinner. They would come in, they were cannibals, they would just simply eat the Hopis. And you say, oh, that's not my history books. Wonder why that one got left out. Then we go back and we have another situation where the Hopis told us a whole bunch of really interesting stuff about how they interfaced. There's a carving of a big moccasin sitting on one of their petroglyph panels, and they took us over and showed us that and says, there's a story that goes with that. And we're saying, well, it's about a 2.5 foot tall moccasin, so we're going to listen. And he says, actually, this was a situation that they recorded for their oral traditions with the symbol on the rock reminding them of that oral tradition. The thing that they ended up doing was a giant had come in and had raided all of the food for the entire winter. The whole tribe was going to, the whole village was going to be starving for the winter. So they picked their most brave, ferocious, whatever warrior and sent him after the giant that was dragging all of the food back up into the Arizona Strip area. And if you think about this, this is about a 5 foot tall individual and about a 12 foot tall giant. That means that really you're only about waist high at best. Well, apparently there was only one part of the giant's anatomy that was really vulnerable at that point, and so this particular warrior decided that he would take advantage of that and literally went in and castrated the giant. And while he was laying on the ground, breathing in pain, he actually ended up taking his moccasins off so he couldn't follow him back to the village. Took all the food and ran back. And the village was real happy. They took the moccasin down, made an outline of it, and that's now in their tradition, their oral tradition. So you say, it's hard to sit there and say, what would life be like with no guns, no anything else? You're just a little guy out there farming to try to feed your family, and then have big guys that harass you on a regular basis. You weren't even sure when you went to sleep at night that you weren't going to be dinner the next morning. Interesting to interface with the indigenous people when you get back to their actual legends and lores. They are actually a lot more interesting than we have some of ours. All right, when we go looking for giants, what are the things we end up doing? We found that there are certain things that show up every time. In proximity to anywhere you have a giant tomb, you're going to have this really strange writing start showing up. It's not it's literally carved like a petroglyph. It just has absolutely no Native American similarity. Matter of fact, the only thing that really looks like is there's an ankh, so it's like more like Egyptian stuff. This goes back to the fact that we think that the Atlantean dispersal of information actually started coming back with the giants. Or else they just remembered it. They were still inactive repel. This is another symbol. We've had a lot of these interpreted. They're really not important except for the fact that they have a lot of Egyptian characters in them. This is a Tanit symbol. It's actually laid on its side, loosely translated, from heaven they come, from heaven they return. Remember, these were off-planet beings for a long time interfacing with the human race. You turn this up right, it's about right over here, just 15, 20 feet away is a giant tomb. So this is another one of the symbols. We get these really strange, unique symbols whenever we are in proximity to the giants area of or actually where they were actually found. So we'll quickly go through one little sidebar here. When you see things by association, you're trying to put things together, you're trying to fit unrelated things that you came across as far as information, put it back, make sense out of them. So when you're sitting there seeing a guy like this, I was sitting in the back of my truck. These were 10-foot tall guys. I'm up on the Grand Canyon Rim. They're sitting there 50 feet away. Kind of gives you a little disconcert. Really tough to go to sleep that night. But you're 30 miles from the nearest road, and here you are sitting there with 10-foot tall beings showing up in your 50 feet away from where you're going to sleep for the night in the camping situation. That was a real interesting decision. When we got home, after you kind of had the adrenaline rush, we started doing homework. So, gee, funny thing, look what shows up. These are all Indian panels. The panels are actually, we're convinced they were seeing pretty much the same thing I saw. Not only did we go back and find that they were there, then people did a little presentation one time, and a guy walked up and gave me a book and says, hey, that looks just like this thing in the book. I'm saying, yeah, well, there's a certain similarity. And there's similarity to these guys. But there's also the other alternative. When we went back after that intuitively, we found that those two individuals, those two beings, were actually underground people. We were on one of their access points, and they were just interested in what we were doing and watching what we were doing because we were looking for cave entrances. So we were told those were actually, scouts from the underworld that were watching what we were doing on the surface. Interesting idea. Here's another problem. When you go see things on a rock, they can be all kinds of things. This is just a regular petroglyph. Looks like every Indian in the world could have, carved it in the rock. Well, when you start looking at that by association, here's your little guy with his little 3 lines coming down. This came off from a tablet coming out of Burroughs Cave in Illinois. It doesn't take a real big stretch to see that you got a sun and 3 lines showing up. Then you go back in the same kind of deal. This is actually off of an old medieval painting. Again, you have the lines coming down out of the sky. What are we talking about? You have to go back and make these association assessments. Is this what they were really referring to? Tough to do when they've been dead for 5,000 years. All right, here's another thing. We have language problems. We find metal plates with the giants. So we have all of these language issues. Not known languages, nothing to be translated. A few of them can be, most of them not. Then we come back and we start getting into this issue where we have American Indian artifacts, and then we come back and start showing up with giant things. In this particular case, what we ended up with was, this is a panel. Interprets loosely, was interpretable as the fact that 2 surviving groups, giants, did not know each other existed. And they met in this little box canyon area. And it was such an important event to them because they were a declining race anyway, that they actually carved this in the rock to commemorate that meeting. Interesting idea, and it is still interpretable. There are people who know the old languages. Then we hit things like this where you don't really know what that language is. If anybody else does, I'd certainly like to talk to you. They're coming out of what we call the giant locations. All right, this is what it looks like when you go looking. There's caves, there's washouts, there's all kinds of stuff. In these kind of caves, you'll find giant remains. In some cases. Then we found there was actually a little lead ring with giant, came out of one of the caves where one of the big boys was found. So when you go back in these caves, you're sitting there saying, well, what's in those caves? These are all over the entire, of course, from the Vermilion Cliffs all the way over to St. George, Utah, all the way through the Arizona Strip. There's thousands and thousands of miles of sandstone with about that many million capes. So it's really tough to go out and just look for the needle in a haystack. That's why the writing helps us isolate areas to look in. You go out and when you find the writing, you start looking. This is inside one of the capes. Very interesting. Never seen anything like this. I've been all over, seen every petroglyph panel in Arizona and Utah, I think. This is all in relief. That means that those are not carved in. Those have been shallowed out. In other words, everything's been removed and they're now elevated. We believe this was a mat. This is what you have to lay on your back. It's about 4 foot tall ceiling. And we believe this was a pyramid that was referenced in there. And you're laying there and somebody sat there for a long time shaving away the rock and just leaving the high spots. Never seen that before anywhere we've ever been. And this is sitting in one of the giant caves. We'd like to know more. So, bottom line is, we think that was pyramid referenced. All right, why don't you have more giants being found? And primarily that's because they don't look in the right place. We found that this is one of the big ironies. We bury our dead in nice soft dirt where you can dig 6 feet and put them all in and throw dirt in. Giants had a different attitude. They would come in and put their dead in these burial sites along these cliffs. Well, a few thousand years goes by, the top of the cliff keeps falling off. Pretty soon that sucker's a long ways underground. It'll be down in these talus slopes. Not many people go back and with a pick and shovel along all the cliffs in the American Southwest and start digging. So that leaves you the big needle in the haystack thing. How do you narrow down the needle in the haystack? I just made my Sunday or Saturday morning decision to go find giants. How do I go find them? So we found a few, and the few started giving us clues. So I'll show you what we found. When you have a big slope like this, giants were using hard rock to bury their dead. So they come in and carve a hole. Actually, they start a couple holes, flip a capstone lid off of each hole, because it was actually the original sandstone that was there. That's why they're so dang difficult to find. They pull the lids off, and then they'd start digging a shaft. And those shafts are usually 30 to 40 feet deep. They're usually solid stone. Very rarely have we found them in anything soft. And then they would, most cases, almost all the ones we found have been 2 shafts. Occasionally, in a few instances, they actually hook the 2 shafts together at the bottom. Usually in one of the shafts there's a male, one of them has a female. They were usually buried together. So when they were done, what they would do is put their bodies in, and then they would put in a layer of sand, layer of clay, layer of sand, layer of clay, all the way back up to the top. That's for those of you that know a little bit about what clay does. That's like just putting a layer of wax across the thing and sealing out all the water. That's why you have some extremely well-preserved giants. Wherever those clay seals and sand seals stayed intact, they're almost 100% preserved. Desert does a real good job of dehydrating, and you'll see that in a minute. This is what the shafts look like when you find them. This was something put back over so that people would not find it. It was not the original. Just threw some boards across it so people would not stumble on it. And if you'll see, there's this one shaft. This is the other shaft down here in the picture. This is a little better picture of it. And they go down 40 feet. This is another set. These are 2 other sets. This one, same deal. I want you to look at how smooth those walls are. There you cannot see a pick mark. You cannot see anything. Those are just smooth as glass. We have absolutely nothing that we could do today that would not leave construction or drill marks. And yet they're pretty much just vertical shafts 40 feet deep. And they're carved in solid rock. Well, most people don't go looking for graveyards in solid rock. When you get down into the tombs, oh, this one was really interesting. This sucker is 37 feet deep, but it has an 8-inch shelf that spirals clear to the bottom, just like a corkscrew. And you're going, okay, that's a little tough to build even with today's tools. How'd they do it with no pick marks? Nothing. You do not see any indication they sat there and hammered that sucker out. All right, then we get to the problem of what do you do with the bones? because you have a whole bunch of archaeological laws in place today, you'll never see any of this stuff again. Most of these you're going to see came out in the 60s before they passed the Antiquities Act. Otherwise, you would have nothing. It's guaranteed that you will never see anything like this again because of the government's actions. However, there were skeletal remains being taken out in Nevada, Arizona, and Utah. This is what they look like. This is actually a giant laying at the bottom of one of those shafts. Two things you want to pay attention to. We've had chiropractors, physicians look at this thing. I want you to look at that lobe right there on the head. That's why this is blowing up. This is your eye socket up here. This is where you would normally be. This would be solid bone in us. We have a temple soft spot, but that's it. And then they have a double lobe on this particular individual. This head actually goes choop, choop. And believe me, that really interests the chiropractors and some of the physicians. Here's another one. This is a 9-foot blonde lady. And that hair is brilliant blonde. There's still some of that in mason jars in people's houses. And it's about as blonde as you can get. Looks like peroxide blonde. And you notice that she was wrapped up in some very interesting linens. This is another one sitting at the bottom of a shaft. This was an 8-foot lady. This is another shot. Now we got to understand, this is one of the problems you have. Not only do we have the government working against you, you have some churches that like this stuff, so they'll pay any amount. And it's on private ground. And the guys that have been around for a while, like the old ranchers that have had the ranches in multiple family generations, have found that they will actually, everywhere you find a burial site, you will find an artifact cache within about 1,000 feet of that site. And they know what's in those caches, and it's good stuff. And so the ranchers don't want to tell you where their skeletons are or what they know, because they know that there's also artifact caches that have got gold and all kinds of stuff in them. And they're out there looting and pillaging and plundering, but you know, we have a law that says you can't do that, but that means everything goes in the black market instead of being on the surface. That's how this world works. This is a red-haired guy. The photo has started to shift to the red bands, but this guy had flaming red hair. But I want you to look at how well he's preserved. He's sitting at the bottom of one of those sand clay deals. They have almost, except for that fact right there that his cheek popped in, he had almost 100% preservation. And they did this interesting thing to keep the nose structure from falling down. They slipped that knot of wood through his head. Another one laying at the bottom of one of the graves. These are some artifacts that came out of one of the graves. They look pretty traditional, pretty Native American, pretty simple. These are the ones that were buried with them. These are everyday items. The things that you don't see are the artifacts that are worth money. They usually disappear in the black market or melted down, which is really a crime in my opinion. All right, I'll take you one real quick thing of one of our adventures. We were out looking for things. This is one of the ways we found it. This is up in central Utah actually, and we were looking for the artifacts that were available. We're looking in an area that has lines, similar to Nazca lines, no explanation for them, real old ones. We go in, we find a tomb. We find the tomb, you cannot take pictures in it, and there is, so everything came out of there. That was back in the emulsion film days. They didn't have digitals, so there's no pictures available. So this is a sketch of the tomb. You came in down a stairway. To get access to this one, there was actually a little rabbit hole had to be dug, which intercepted right here at this thing. This literally has, if you step on that step, you collapse the column. There's a whole set of cache boxes along here. I'll show you real quick. We're running out of time. These are, if you step on this stair, you drop this panel right here above you. This is the old Indiana Jones Dead Man step. You actually had to enter this thing through off to the side of this column. Man in a sarcophagus buried here, woman underneath in a sarcophagus buried here, and a whole stack of caches or artifacts. In the artifacts, they were buried in stone boxes with metal plates in them. This is what the metal plates look like. This box is not from the giant cache. This one is. These are some of the artifacts that are in the boxes. This is a sketch because they could not take pictures in this particular tomb. This is what the guy looked like. Real interesting how he's dressed and what he's got on. This is what the female looked like, sketched. I want you to look at the symbols. Look at what she's wearing. Big head. We actually had an artist reconstruct this for our purposes, and this is what the artistic reconstruction of her was. But look at your symbology. Look at what she's wearing. Look at how she's wearing it. These were all gold. Obviously, there's a reason why a lot of giants don't make the surface, because that is all gold. She's adorned in it. This is the records coming out of those little boxes I showed you over on the sidewall. All kinds of records. Mostly brass, lead, and bronze. 3 different types. They're coming out in languages we don't have any record of, but very similar to cuneiform. They're notched into that metal with a sharp tool. This was an interesting little traveling book about that big. It actually had little pages. You had 4 pages in that book. Each one had a whole set of records on it, or a whole set of writing on it. Again, lead, brass, bronze. These are one of the more interesting ones. We found these are actually maps to other caves or other burial sites in the proximity to this one. We do have a couple people that can hit some interpretation on these. That's how come we know that they're actually maps to other burial sites. We started with 1, there's 7 in that immediate area. Within the last couple of months, we found 4 more. So there are still sites being found as we speak. These are lead inscriptions. This one has a whole bunch of Hebrew stuff on it. What's it doing in a cave with giants? That was the one. If you look at this little guy, he's upside down, but flip him over, he becomes this. Interesting if you want to go back and figure out what that says. There's probably a lot of information there that we don't have any record of. This is some more tablets. All of these are brasses coming out. This is brass, lead, and in various forms. I don't have time to go through a bunch of this. These are all gold ones. They're little guys. They would be like pocket change to us. So, there's still a bunch of stuff that hasn't been found. This is from another tomb. Real interesting problem. You have multiple tombs yielding multiple stuff. You've never seen any of this. None of it's in a museum. Nobody's ever seen this. Will never see the light of day. Then you go back and there's a whole bunch of really weird things that start showing up when you go out there looking. Like this. We're looking for giant tombs there. We pick up a picture of this little guy here. It happens to be a little craft, but the only trouble was there was nothing there when we were there. We were actually under surveillance the whole time we were there. And you have these little kind of weird anomalies when you go out there looking. This is the human footprint, about a 2-footer, and there's dinosaur track in the same layer. That gives you a hard time explaining how your timelines don't quite mesh up. Then you have things like this. This is a different language than what we're used to, that showed up in little gold plates taken out of one of the giant tombs. And of course you have all problems with all kinds of shapes of skulls. Not all of these are giant, they're just old skulls that we have no record of and no explanation for, except for a lot of those look like Akhenaten, if you're familiar with Egypt stuff. So, here's my contention. Yep, they're giants. Yep, you can go find them. If you want to take a Saturday morning, start your own search. I thoroughly encourage it, and thanks.